Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Public Policy program here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Good afternoon, good evening, perhaps good morning, depending on where you're coming in from. My name is Zoe Marks. I'm a lecturer in public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School and an enthusiastic member and supporter of the Women in Public Policy program. This is, as I mentioned, our final seminar of the year. The Women in Public Policy program is dedicated to equipping leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. Our spotlight for this series has been gender and public policy, focused on gender and politics in particular. And we've had an incredible slate of 12 speakers in the series, all of whom have joined us from around the world, and of course, a global audience. So thank you to those of you who are Zooming in today from both near and far. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Alois Stutzer, who's presenting new research on women leaving the playpen, really looking at the emancipating role of female suffrage, a topic that I'm excited to learn more about. Professor Stutzer is the professor of political economy at the University of Basel, and he's the director of the Center for Research in Economics and Well-Being there at the University of Basel. His work deals with the basic effects of political institutions and their impact on the behavior and well-being of various political actors. He's also interested in questions from the fields of public economics, law and economics, and psychology and economics. He's considered one of the leading scholars in the economic analysis of happiness, and his work is cited throughout the social sciences. He's authored numerous scientific publications in peer-reviewed journals and is the co-author of the book Happiness in Economics. I'm also delighted to welcome the Women in Public Policy Program's podcast community. We have downloaded over 59,100 seminars throughout this network, and we're so pleased to have you all be part of our sort of lasting and broad-reaching impact beyond those who are able to be here in person. For those who are here in person today, our speaker will present for about 45 minutes. He's happy to take questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to put questions in the chat, and my co-host, Katie Omberg, will bring those questions to the attention of the speaker. And then we'll have 15 minutes for more of a roundtable discussion where all of you in the virtual audience are welcome to raise your hand, speak up, and again, to continue to add questions in the chat box. I think that's all for now. We're thrilled to have you, Professor Stutzer, and I'll pass it over to you and see you at the end of the talk.
So thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot for the kind introduction, Professor Marks. It's really a great pleasure to get the opportunity to present here our ongoing research on the effect of female suffrage on women's emancipation. And let me share my screen now. So in our research, we draw on a working paper entitled Women Leaving the Playpen, the Emancipating Role of Female Suffrage. And it's joint work with Michaela Slotwinski. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Basel as well as at the ZDW in Mannheim. So let me start with two remarks. In the US, you are now celebrating 100 years female suffrage. In Switzerland, it's only 50 years since the introduction of female suffrage at the federal level. It took quite a long time until in 1971, in a national referendum, a majority of men actually approved female suffrage. It was a gradual process since the end of the 19th century. Throughout this change came about. And I think this is important to emphasize that it was a gradual process that in the end led to this introduction. And this introduction was quite a caesura in the political process in Switzerland. So these movements that were involved were not as revolutionary as in the UK. This is a first remark that I would like to make. There was indeed a radical feminist also in Switzerland, and this was Iris Vonderwalten. And we chose the title according or in relation or in reference to her book, Women in the Playpen, we also wanted to pay tribute to her work and her engagement. She forcefully demanded women's equality, in particular in their economic independence. When she published her book in 1958, this was perceived as quite scandalous with all her demands. And today we would say this really led to a shitstorm. So she was really one of the most criticized person at the time. But of course, it was exactly the engagement of people like her that contributed to this gradual development of this gradual cultural change that we observed in Switzerland. And I would like to start now with 3 different perspectives that you can have on this evolvement of this transformation of women's life in women, regarding women's employment, regarding women's education, but also their role in the family, or now in our case, also their involvement in politics. And this first perspective is one that it's actually this gradual cultural change that led to changes in the economic sphere and in the political sphere. And the change in the economic sphere was quite substantial, not only in Switzerland, but in many countries. For example, when you look at female labor force participation in Switzerland, and this is now based on the data we will use later in our empirical analysis, the labor market participation was below 50% in 1970 and increased to more than 70% in 2010. So it was this change that increased or affected the economic sphere that led then also to introduction, like the introduction of women's voting right in the political sphere. So this is one perspective. Another perspective actually emphasizes the technological advances in the economy that affected women's role on the labor market, and as a consequence of this, also women's role in society more general. And so it's this understanding of a silent revolution in, for example, Claudia Goldin's work that sees the starting point in developments in the economic sphere that then drive, for example, gender norms. Now we would like to emphasize or add a third perspective that concentrates on the forces unleashed by the enfranchisement of women. So it's the empowerment in the political sphere that then affects gender norms and women's life choices in the economic or private sphere. So the main argument here is that female suffrage not only led to a political empowerment, but also increased women's perception of control in their private sphere. So it led to an expansion of their conceived opportunities for them and their daughters in the short and also in the long run. This brings me to the contributions that we would like to make in our paper. First of all, we would like to study whether female suffrage indeed affected female emancipation by studying revealed preferences or women's life choices. Then we wanted to tackle the difficult identification challenges to address when we want to answer this question. As you can imagine, as I've just pointed out, there are different kind of forces that all work together. And we tried to tackle this identification challenge by exploiting the staggered introduction of female suffrage across Swiss states. So in 1971, this was only the end of a process when female suffrage was introduced at the federal level, but before some cantons already introduced it at the sub-federal level. Then we document in our paper that women who experience suffrage later in life actually make systematically different life choices. And from this, we conclude that formal institutions like voting rights do not only mirror norms and preferences, but also hold the power to change them. Of course, there is a big related literature, and there are several strands that you can imagine. There is a literature on the conditions for suffrage extensions, so the strategic calculus of parties when they engage in parliament for the extension of suffrage. Then there is a literature on the consequences. So how is the political process affected after female suffrage is introduced? And in fact, there is quite some evidence for the US and Europe, except Switzerland, where female suffrage has been introduced in the first half of the 20th century, that actually it was related to an increase in public spending. So far, the evidence for Switzerland does not indicate any changes in public spending, at least the two papers that you can see here. In principle, there could be a third strand of literature. However, this is a rather thin one, and we would like to contribute to this. And in this strand, we would like to understand how female suffrage actually affected women's emancipation in other domains of their life. On a more general perspective, we are contributing to the literature on gender norms and how they affect women's socioeconomic outcomes. And there is quite a large and growing literature on the determinants of gender norms and women's outcome. And in a nutshell, I think this literature suggests that there is a strong persistence in gender norms and how they affect outcomes. And this is due to the institutionalization of unequal rights or unequal property rights. However, there is little evidence on whether particular institutions can also change gender norms and roles in the medium term. And this is the angle we would like to address in our research. So the research questions, there are two basically. Do political institutions have the power to change gender roles in the medium term? And did female suffrage actually affect women's emancipation, thereby also their life choices? For our reasoning, we build on two theoretical ideas, two building blocks. And the first one is from the social psychology of self-efficacy. And it's the idea that the right to participate in decisions increases the perception of control. It contributes to the perception of being causal. It increases people's perception of agency. It strengthens their bargaining power. So this would be the first building block. The second one would be, comes from this work about impressionable years. So it's the idea that experiences affect attitudes and beliefs to a different degree depending at which age people are confronted with them. So experiences early on in a person's life are much more influential, have much more impact than later on in their life. So this is work about personality development over the life course. And we want to combine this idea, these two ideas or theoretical aspects with the institutional change that came about by the introduction of female suffrage. And the hypothesis would be quite straightforward, that women who were mainly socialized under female suffrage, so women who experienced this empowerment early on in their life, are more emancipated. And that we expect that this emancipation actually translates in women's life choices on the labor market when it comes to marital decisions, but also regarding educational choices. That it would be in the private or economic realm, but of course we would also expect that this affects political behavior. When women experienced are more experienced in politics, are earlier experienced in politics, and have more time to also develop, for example, a habit in political participation. And most directly, that it would affect their perceived control. Now we are studying this hypothesis, that this idea, in the Swiss institutional context. Why are we using the Swiss institutional context? It's attractive because Switzerland is, like the US, a federal state. So like in the US, female suffrage was first introduced in some of the cantons, or these are our states in Switzerland. And overall, it took quite some time. So the first votes took place in the 1920s. Overall, it took more than 60 cantonal and 2 federal popular votes until there was an almost uniform political participation right for women and men. As I've mentioned before, the successful national referendum was in 1971. On the right, you can see an unfriendly advertisement against female suffrage that was presented in the campaign against the national referendum in 1959. But what was the outcome of this process was that there were some cantons in which women actually were already allowed to vote in cantonal referendums in 1959. For example, in the canton of Vaud or the canton of Neuchâtel, but they were also quite early allowed to vote, for example, in the canton of Geneva, in the 2 cantons of Basel, but also in this rural, quite conservative canton of Walden. And it's this variation that women from the same cohort, depending on the canton in which they lived, experienced female suffrage at a different age. And it's this variation that we would like to exploit. And I summarize that here. So we exploit the variation in the age of exposure within cohorts across cantons, and then also within cantons across cohorts. Depending on when you're born, you experience it either early in your life or late in your life. Now, in the empirical analysis, we study census data. So this provides us with the necessary power to really test these effects, potentially small effects on women's life choices. And we draw on data about women's life choices that materialized after the last, in the last canton, female suffrage was introduced. So the data start in 1980. And then we have data for 30 years. And we have thus full access to all Swiss women observed in Switzerland, and we observe all their life choices. This includes in our main sample women from the birth cohorts between 1913 and 1984.
And Alois, I have a question coming in from the chat, which is, do you have statistics on the distribution of the population across the cantons?
So we're not aggregating anything here. So we have individual level data across the cantons. Yes. So overall, we know for about 2.5 million women that they have lived and experienced the introduction of female suffrage in the canton, in the place where they, So we know where they were born, and we can clearly allocate the year when they experienced the introduction of female suffrage.
Great, thank you.
Now, what we are doing in our analysis, and this is only to develop the idea, we want to compare women of a similar age or women from the same cohort who have experienced the exposure to female suffrage at a different age. So here, what you see is at different ages, what is the probability that somebody is working? And so we have two averages. So the probability, or the average for people who actually experienced female suffrage early in their life, so before the age of 17. This is the average in the black circles, and those who experienced it late in life. So after the age of 16, these are the white diamonds. What you can see here is, on average, those who experienced it earlier are more likely to go for gainful employment. And of course, what you can also immediately recognize, this is not really addressing many empirical challenges that we face when we want to compare these groups, because those who experience it late were probably also older cohorts, people who were born earlier, and for this reason they might be less likely to go for paid employment. And so in the next step, I would like to explain how we address these challenges to identify the effect of the experience of female suffrage on individuals' life choices. First of all, there are cantonal differences. So there are more liberal, more conservative cantons, and so we include cantonal fixed effects. There are the cohorts different, of course, systematically. Older cohorts, women in these older cohorts grew up in a more traditional environment in general, and we want to take care of this. So we include cohort fixed effects. There are life cycle effects. So when women turn older, they're less likely to work because they are close to retirement. During childbearing age, they are less likely to work. So we include age-year specific effects. There are, of course, economic conditions that differ over time, so we have time fixed effects. You see from this in spirit, this is close to previous work that tries to measure the consequences of experience early on in life on later life outcomes. So like in the work of Malmedier and Nagel, Giuliano and Spilling-Bergo, or Fox-Schündel and Schündel. Critical for our analysis, we assume that there are no canton cohort-specific factors that affect the same cohorts in a similar way as female suffrage. So there are no other events that are correlated with the introduction of female suffrage that have nothing to do in terms of substance with female suffrage, and affected at the cantonal level the cohorts in a similar way. So the idea is that cohorts would have evolved in parallel, these cantonal cohorts, if they had not been exposed to female suffrage. Of course, this assumption cannot be tested. This is clear, but in our context, we can at least address it in an interesting way. So we can study second-generation foreign women who were actually not allowed to vote when female suffrage was introduced in the cantons, but of course were exposed otherwise to the same changes in the environment. And I will come back to that later after I have presented the main results. Before I show you the results, I would like to be really specific and exact when it comes to the specification of our linear probability model. And so what I will show you afterwards, I will show you the outcomes for individuals living in a particular canton at a particular time or year, T, either 1980, 1990, 2000, or 2010. And we statistically explain or predict this outcome based on birth cohort fixed effects, and then on the age fixed effects, but we allow these patterns to be canton specific. Also, the year effects we allow to be canton specific, as there might be differences in the economic environment that that change or differ across cantons. Then we also take into account municipality fixed effects that control for time invariant regional factors. And importantly, we also control for women's denomination, because women's denomination might of course be related to their norms. And then, these are 4 indicator variables defining the age range within which a woman was exposed to female suffrage. The reference group is women who experiences between the age of 0 and 16, and then the first indicator variable that is set to 1 if the woman experiences not when really young, but between the age of 17 and 20. The second indicator variable between the age of 21 and 25, 26 and 35, or when they were older than 35. Now, I think this is important to mention here. This is not difference in difference estimation approach. So we observe the outcomes years after the introduction of female suffrage. So it's not that we study did women actually change their employment right after the introduction of female suffrage, but instead we study how the life choices they made after they have been exposed to female suffrage evolved over time and accumulated in different levels of, for example, employment. This is what we want to show. And now here I show you the main results, and I will provide quite some explanations, and I will show you also some graphs that you can understand this quite dense table. So let me concentrate on the first specification on the here in the first column. So it's about gainful employment of women. So we have more than 2 million women in this estimation from 26 different cantons. On average, these women who are between the age of 26 and 67, 55% are working, 55% are working. We are taking into account all these different fixed effects that I've mentioned, like, for example, their birth year. And now we compare what is the probability that somebody is working in comparison. So when she experienced female suffrage, not between the age of 0 and 16, but later. And compared to somebody who experienced it early on in life, those experience it only at the age of 17 to 20, the probability to work is 1.5 percentage points lower. Also for those to a similar magnitude for those at the age who experience it at the age of 21 to 25 instead of before 17. And for those who experienced it even after these impressionable years that are often mentioned in the literature, the difference is even bigger. So for those who experience it after the age of 36, remember, controlling for all these other characteristics like the year they are born, the difference is 6 percentage points. And this is quite a big effect. So it's more than 10%. It's more than 10% when you compare it to the mean probability of working. Now, here you can see these effects presented graphically. So compared to those who experienced female suffrage before the age of 17, the probability is lowered the later they experienced it. And now some more results I show you only in the graph. When it comes to divorce, those who experienced female suffrage later, they are less likely to divorce, as you can see here. Also, ceteris paribus. And now I think this is another important result. for those who experience it later, they are more likely to only have a basic education, so that they only finished mandatory schooling. That means 8 to 9 years of schooling. So they did not engage in any vocational education. And this is exactly the situation that, for example, my mother experienced. She wanted to become a teacher, but her parents didn't think that this would be appropriate or necessary. She rather wanted her to work on the farm and alternately work as a maid and then to marry. And this is actually what she did. And this is what we observe here. Those who experienced this female suffrage late in life, they're less likely to have a further education. So you saw, so there have been more results on the table before, and I summarized them here. For women who experienced female suffrage later, they are not only less likely to work, but or be in paid work, but they're also more likely to be a housewife. And if they work, they're more likely to work part-time. They're more likely to be ever married. And then on separate data sources, from survey data, we have learned that women who experienced female suffrage later, they are also less engaged in politics. So within the political sphere, we observe that they are less likely to turn out in elections. And here the effect is even larger. I mean, or it seems larger. The probability if a woman only experienced the right to vote after the age of 35, she's about 10 percentage points less likely to participate in national elections. And in another data set, we also observed that they report a lower perception of control over their lives. Now, in our, or I think maybe during the remaining time, I would like to discuss some of the tests that we undertook to actually validate our main analysis and conclusions. And we did many tests in our paper to actually understand, are we really contributing to the third perspective, that it's this empowerment that affects this outcome in the private sphere. And of course, there is this identifying assumption that cohorts, that relates to the question, would cohorts across cantons have evolved in parallel if not for the introduction of female suffrage? And as I've mentioned before, we cannot formally test it. However, we can look at second generation foreign women, and there are quite many of them in Switzerland. So we have a large fraction of foreigners in Switzerland. And so this means that these women were actually born in Switzerland. They were raised in Switzerland. They went to school to Switzerland. They married in Switzerland if they married. And we can study when they lived in a canton, or depending on the canton they lived in, at which age did their fellow Swiss women actually receive the right to vote. And if there was something correlated with this introduction of female suffrage that affected women in general, we should also observe this for these foreign women. Of course, foreign women were anyway socializing with Swiss women, so even if there were no such effect, they could still react to the introduction of female suffrage because they perceived Swiss women as a role model and copied their behavior. So a similarity of patterns for foreign women would not be actually evidence against our hypothesis. However, if we observe a weaker pattern, that would be evidence in line with the proposed mechanism. And now I show you the graph with the results for these foreign women. So again, it's the difference in the probability that they are working when they live in a canton or where they would have received the right to vote when they are already older compared to when they were below the age of 17. So it's actually, so we impute here the situation that their fellow Swiss women experienced. And I concentrate here on the groups that would have experienced it in their between the age of 17 and 20 and 21 and 25. These are the biggest samples. So for these two groups, we have the biggest samples. And we do not see that they are less likely to work. In fact, the point estimate is slightly positive. And this is quite in contrast to what we observe for the Swiss women who were less likely to work if they experienced it later in these very same cantons. Now we did a series of further validation tests. So to study this idea that there are parallel canton cohort trends. We can, of course, also study the pre-trends, and we can study whether the pre-trends are similar up to the cohort for which we would think this is the last one that should not be affected from the introduction of female suffrage. And we can do that for different outcomes that we expect should be rather stable and should not indicate any divergence before the first kind of generation is affected. And this is exactly what we observe. Then in another set of tests, we can study more generally cantonal priest-tests in historical data. So do we observe any patterns that look suspicious, for example, in divorce rates in general, that they develop differently in the cantons that adopted female suffrage earlier. And we do that for a series of variables for which we have historical data available, and we did not find anything suspicious. The fourth test is we can undertake because in 1971, when actually female suffrage was introduced at the federal level, this change was not supported by a majority in each of the Swiss cantons. So there were 7 cantons that did not have female suffrage at the time, and were still not a majority was supporting female suffrage. Of course, because there was a majority at the federal level and the majority of states actually supported it, it was introduced anyway. And so women got the right to vote at least at the federal level, also in these cantons. And so we also study whether the effects still hold for these women who actually lived in an environment where this change in the constitution was not supported, or supported to a much lower degree. And actually we find quite similar effects. Now the fifth test, I think, is important to make the argument that it's really a consequence of this empowerment, of this idea that it increased females' agency, and that is that it did not change cantonal policies. And we undertook we undertook 2 additional tests here. And first of all, we studied how it affected cantonal elections and the outcome in terms of electoral support of the Swiss Social Democratic Party at the cantonal level. And we do that in an event study, and we did not find any increase in the support of this party. Also, we did not see, we found a proxy for this social policy, and we did not find any changes in cantonal child allowances. I will not go through all this point of potential alternative drivers. So the idea, is it only an effect of the change, differential evolvement of education? So we conditioned on that, on the highest educational attainment, and this is not driving the results. Is it a result of selective fertility? So we're only considering women who were born after actually female suffrage was introduced in their canton. The results still hold. We also do a number of tests with placebo introduction years to see whether it might be some event just around, before or after the year of the introduction of female suffrage that might drive the results. And as soon as you deviate slightly, effects get much smaller, and rarely we actually get estimates that are bigger. I mean, rarely, that means less than 1%, often less than 1% of cases. We also check for robustness for single influential cantons. We do alternative inference with cluster wild bootstrap confidence intervals. This does not really change our results. So from this, we conclude that the introduction of the voting right for women seems to have changed women's gender norms and roles as captured in their life choices. Women who primarily grew up in a world where women had no say in politics, they are less likely to work. And if they work, they're more likely to work part-time. They are more likely to marry. And if they ever marry, they're more likely to divorce. And they're less likely to divorce, and they're more likely less educated, so they did not engage in some vocational training. In additional evidence, we found that political behavior is affected, in particular women's probability that they participate at the national level in politics is reduced substantially when they were experiencing female suffrage later in their life. Also, their perceived control. And the validation checks that we undertook do not indicate the violation of the identifying assumption. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alois. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat or go down to, sometimes it's in the reactions, sometimes it's under participants, the raise hand icon. And Zoe, did I see your hand? Do you have a question?
I didn't raise my hand because I wanted to hold space for people while others are gathering their thoughts. Alois, I would love for you to talk me through, even not so much with regards to the data and all the tests, which I think are actually brilliant and really compelling. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the relational dynamics that your data represent. Like, really what I'm interested in getting at is like, what is happening with men vis-a-vis these sort of changing behaviors that the data pick up, right? So as women are changing, their marital behavior obviously usually requires two people to be affected by that. As they're changing access to education, as they're changing their work, you're Swiss, I gather. Like, what are you thinking is the kind of theory of change or like series of causal relationships? When do men come in? When do they shift their attitudes? There's obviously some prior movement because of what actually ultimately got the suffrage through in 1971 at the latest possible date. But that was really what was going through my mind, is just to kind of understand how these two kind of groups, gendered groups, are moving together.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for this question. So first of all, I think, yes, this is important. So men were really important because they had the say on when female suffrage was introduced. So it has never been introduced through a complete constitutional reform in kind of a constitutional council, but it was always the ordinary male citizen who had to approve these changes. And so it really required both a sufficient majority of men who supported the cause and it needed some external event that actually led then to an initiative or a proposal from the parliament that then actually led to this caesuras that unleashed, or that it led to the introduction and unleashed this empowerment of women. So this is important to understand, and then I think you're pointing at an important aspect. When it comes to marriage, of course, men were also affected, and in fact, men were more likely to be married if they lived in a canton where actually women received the right to vote late in, So, because yes, it needs to, and if in cantons where actually women received this right earlier, more women were actually empowered and exposed and were reluctant to go into a marriage that they thought might not be that worthwhile. Men were also less likely to actually find a partner. So this should go in parallel, and it goes in parallel. When it comes to employment, there, of course, it would be strange, or if we would observe the same pattern for men, this might indicate that it still has something to do with correlated conditional canton court-specific changes on the labor market. And there we do not find anything. Oh yeah, thanks for terminating. So there we did not find anything. And this is actually, I think, reassuring that it has nothing to do with men, for example, retracting from the labor market and then women coming in, or something that is correlated.
Thank you for that question. See, we have one in the chat, but before that, I saw Allison had raised her hand. So Allison, I'm going to ask to unmute you now to ask your question.
Great, thank you very much for this presentation. It's very, very, very interesting. So your design is very geographically conscribed with cantons and then the country of Switzerland. I'm just wondering how you'd like us to think about global changes in social norms that say might be a confounder, because they might affect younger generations more, maybe access to internet. And I'm sure it's something you thought of. Just wonder how you'd like us to kind of think about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming back to this aspect. So this is when I was referring to these alternative perspectives at the beginning that are not mutually exclusive. This is, of course, referring to exactly to one perspective that you are referring to. There is an incredible kind of norm and cultural change over time that is just global. And this, of course, might drive both developments. So it led to so over time, it was necessary, this change, that it led to the introduction of female suffrage. It also probably contributed to the developments on the marriage market in the economy. And of course, this is a challenge for us for the empirical application, as we want to understand the third mechanism that I was emphasizing, that there is really something on top coming from the political empowerment. And so we are not negating the force that you are emphasizing, that there was also a general underlying development, but that there is something coming on top. And in this setting, we can actually identify this. And this is rather, it generated a rather big difference in the Swiss setting. Of course, we cannot explain, the change in female employment was, of course, much bigger. It went probably over time from 20 to more now 80%. But we observed that this experience of female suffrage early or late in life can explain up to 6 percentage points. So yeah, it depends on you whether you consider this is a small effect in comparisons to the overall development. But we think as a kind of an effect that comes more or less from a psychological mechanism of empowerment, this is quite substantial.
Thank you so much. And I'll share now the question that I saw come in the chat from Haja, giving gratitude for the presentation. And then they ask, I'm curious to hear about how you accounted for omitted variable bias and how you imagine the findings to change from an intersectional lens.
So I think we would have to discuss at which level you are thinking of an omitted variable bias. I think many variables that are unobserved, we control by our very flexible fixed effect strategies. So whether it's something omitted and unobserved at the level of cantons, because there are more liberal and more conservative cantons, we take that into account. When you think of omitted variables, because some women are born during the war and this affected their life, yes, we are taking that into account because we have cohort-specific fixed effects. So it would need to be an omitted variable that is correlated with the introduction of female suffrage. So it would need to be something that affects women born in specific years, so specific cohorts at the cantonal level. And of course, if there is something that we have not come across in our reading also of the literature, that might drive the results. And that's why we did all this additional testing to see, might there be an indication that there is some correlated canton cohort specific variable that we did not learn about when reading the historic literature.
Great. Zoe, go for it.
Yeah, sorry to come back in here, but I was curious, and I have to say I'm totally curious, mostly from a social perspective, not so much with regards to whether it changes the results. But I'm curious if women moved as a result of suffrage. I imagine that there would be some self-selection into the geography, and I know that you account for this, I think, if I understand the methodology correctly, based on the sort of birth canton that people are coming from. But just in terms of the social and political life of women in Switzerland, did women move to places where they could be empowered? I mean, I assume Geneva was a draw, Basel's a draw for complicated multiple reasons, exactly. But also, like, how do you think about that in the broader kind of story of what this project represents?
So I think this is important, and men and women usually move for work or love, and this is certainly the case also in Switzerland. And in fact, we might come up with rather complicated stories about self-selection of more liberal, more women into places where actually female suffrage was adopted earlier. And this, but if this would be, and then of course there, yeah. And so we don't know where these other women who are not living in the canton where they, so we don't know where they were born, if they were not born in the canton where they live now. So it would be nice, of course, to follow them over time. But we wanted to see whether actually that somehow those who experienced female suffrage later, whether they were actually, and now I have to, that they were actually less likely to live in the canton where they were born because they actually had reasons to move away. But actually we find right the opposite, that they're more likely. And this does not depend on whether they are from a canton that introduced female suffrage early on. So to once more respond to your questions, yes, I think we could come up with really complicated stories of self-selection. And the tests that we do about their sorting and the probability of changing canton do not indicate, or I mean, to the extent that we can test that. But of course, I mean, this is still the case, as it is everywhere, that this is also a force, these differential norms. And when I was referring to, at the beginning, to Iris Vonderwalten, she was coming from Basel, and then she was marrying in a conservative canton, more or less from an aristocratic family. I mean, her husband was very open-minded, but her environment was not at all. And so this was, of course, difficult, and in fact, she moved back to Basel later on in her life. So yes, this is important, is also important for our setting.
Wonderful. Well, fascinating. For the sake of time, I might close the conversation here. I don't want us to run into running over, which is usually my tradition when I'm tasked with keeping time. But Alois, thank you for sharing this work with us. It's really interesting. And I just love the layered story that you've told with your co-author, Michaela, about Iris and the work that she was doing, and then the kind of changes that followed, and how you've been able to track that back using some really, really clever robustness tests and quite detailed data. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for ending our brilliant semester speaker series on such a strong note. For those of you who are interested in listening to more Women in Public Policy program seminars over the summer, if you're missing us, remember we have a podcast on the website, and otherwise we will be back next September, perhaps in person, but probably always streaming, even if we're in person. Katie and the whole team at the Women in Public Policy program here at the Harvard Kennedy School, thank you so much for all you've done to put on this brilliant show. And everyone, please take care of yourselves.